to the cloud. Okay, thank you for coming to this talk on critical race theory. This is our general membership meeting of our NAACP, Lebanon County Branch 26AA. And my name is Michael Schroeder, and I'm the secretary of the branch, and I'm delighted to be offering this little talk on critical race theory because it's been in the news. People heard all about CRT. What is it and what isn't it? As you can see here from the images across the top, this has become a really hot button issue in the United States over the past couple years or so. And we're going to actually talk about how that has come to pass. And how it sort of emerged over the past couple years as this hot button issue. So let me just make a few opening points here. This is tough stuff to deal with. Dealing with issues of race and slavery in American history is inherently challenging, especially for white people, because they tend to get defensive and feel guilty about it. So this is tough stuff. I'd also like to offer a disclaimer at the beginning is I am not an expert in critical race theory. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a legal scholar. But what I am is a historian and a college history professor, and I teach about race a whole lot. And as I see it, I'm sort of looking at this through the lens of a historian, and why I, as a historian, find critical race theory very helpful as a way to look at American history. Critical race theory is actually an intellectual tradition that goes back almost 50 years, back to the 1970s and 1980s, and really even before. But it's an intellectual tradition in legal studies, very obscure in many ways for the past 5 or so decades, mainly taught in graduate schools for legal scholars. But its origins, again, go much deeper. People have been talking about race and the law in American history since the foundation of the Republic. So again, it's taught in grad schools. It's not taught in K-12 or even in colleges. It's just too elevated and too sort of arcane for K-12 or college. And the basic idea behind critical race theory is that racism and white supremacy are systemic and woven into our legal system and our society and our political structures in this country. That is that's the sort of the basic underpinnings of critical race theory that is woven throughout, that is systemic as part of our institutional structures. And then very recently, it has been seized upon and weaponized by the right wing and the Republican Party as part of the ongoing culture wars against the left and the Democratic Party. So it has become very much a part of our political discord here in this country. My own interpretation, this is my view now, is that at its core, critical race theory is about engaging US history honestly, especially with respect to race relations and the law. This is what it really focuses on. Let's talk a little bit about what critical race theory is not, because you hear all kinds of stuff in the media about what critical race theory is. And we're trying to disabuse of some of these notions. Again, it's not taught in K-12 public schools or in most colleges. It is not about teaching white children to feel guilty about being white. It's not about teaching white children that they are oppressors. It's not saying that all white people are racist. It's not saying that America is a wicked and a racist nation. It is not saying that American democracy is a lie. It's not indoctrinating children with Marxism. It's not divisive. It's not anti-American. And it's not a threat to the American way of life. It is none of these things, even though it is framed and pitched and presented oftentimes as one or many of these. How exactly did this become weaponized? It's actually a really interesting story. There's an article in the New Yorker from June of 2021, about a year after George Floyd's murder, by Benjamin Wallace Wells. He's actually the brother of David Wallace Wells, who writes on climate change for the New Yorker and elsewhere. And it focuses, it's a really interesting article. I encourage you to read it. You can get it free online. How a conservative activist invented the conflict over critical race theory. This guy named Christopher Rufo. He's out in the Seattle area. And he found this and sort of it occurred to him that this could be a really useful political kind of weapon as a way to divide people and to drum up, kind of throw red meat at the base of the Republican Party. And so that's essentially what happened, that he sought to kind of put this out into the public spotlight, present it to conservative news media personalities such as Tucker Carlson, such as Laura Ingraham, such as the other personalities, Sean Hannity and others that populate Fox News in particular, as well as these other cable shows. And then it became part of a much broader, as part of this kind of this propaganda effort, really, it became an integral part of this ongoing conversation in America. Here's a really interesting graph that kind of illustrates this. Again, this is a legal kind of a legal tradition that goes all the way back to the 1970s and 1980s. These are Fox News mentions of critical race theory as the Media Matters for America kind of graphed it out and watched all these shows and graphed out every time it was mentioned. And we can see from June of 2020, this is right at George Floyd, right? Right when there was all the social turmoil about the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, it was mentioned 3 times. In July of 2020, 6 times, 3 times. By September, that was right around the time that his article came out, Christopher Rufo's, 69 mentions. And then we can see the precipitous rise in mentions on Fox News beginning in the spring of 2021. And it just exploded after that. It just became a hot button issue, mainly on Fox News. So essentially it was invented as kind of an issue. So, you know, it kind of drives people crazy. People go bonkers. So that's kind of a background of how it became weaponized by the right wing in this country and really distorted in some pretty profound ways. So I'd be happy to kind of return back to that whole story and talk more about this Christopher Rufo, but that would be more of a digression, I think. So what I'd like to do is kind of start over, and in the remainder of this talk, again, what is critical race theory? How does it offer a useful framework for understanding U.S. history and society today? And then open it up for question and for dialogue. So what is critical race theory? This is from a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, a founding critical race theorist and professor of law at UCLA and Columbia University. And she writes as follows. She writes, critical race theory is a practice. It is an approach to grappling with the history of white supremacy that rejects the belief that what's in the past is in the past, and that the laws and systems that grow from that past are detached from it. There is no canonical set of doctrine or methodology to which we all subscribe, she continues. Although critical race theory scholarship differs in object, argument, accent, and emphasis, it is nevertheless unified by 2 common interests. First, to understand how a regime of white supremacy and its subordination of people of color have been created and maintained in the United States of America. And then secondly, not merely to understand the vexed bond between law and racial power, but to change it. And what we see here is the cover of a compendium of essays that Kimberly Crenshaw and others put together and published in 1995, almost 30 years ago. Okay, and this book I got at LVC and brought it home and read parts of it, including the introduction by Kimberly Crenshaw. And that is just the image of the cover. So again, this book is almost 30 years old. So this is not anything new. What is critical race theory? Again, these are some of the key concepts, this cluster of ideas that kind of come together are the main sort of concerns of critical race theorists. First, this is a story. Critical race theory focuses on relationships. It's a very relational story. And in particular, it focuses on political relationships. That is, relations of power and of privilege. That is, when we're talking about power and we're talking about privilege, we're talking about relations of domination and subordination. Who's dominant and who is subordinate. And we see with this kind of Venn diagram here, the different ways that people can be either dominated or subordinated in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of class, in terms of gender, in terms of your abilities, nationalism, we could add religion to this list, sexual orientation. This is what is meant by the notion of intersectionality. This is a key, I know it sounds like jargon. Many people take it as jargon, but it's actually a very simple concept. It's how do these different ways of, these social relationships of domination and subordination, how do they intersect? So for instance, how is it different if you are a Black female versus a white female, or a poor Black female, or a rich white male, etc.? So the ways that these intersect and combine in various ways in terms of relations of domination and subordination. And in particular, the focus is the ways that race has been actually created through law, that it is a legal category. And we'll look at some very specific examples of this, of how race emerged in American history as a very specific kind of legal category that is inscribed in codes of law. Another key element in this cluster of ideas about what that focus on critical race theory is the notion of lived experience, that the lived experience of those who are actually being subordinated, whether that's an enslaved person, a person of color under Jim Crow, whatever kind of subordinated person, the relationship that we're talking about, the lived experience of being subordinated is a critical sort of element of this that the critical race theorists focus on. So these are some of the key concepts that we'll kind of keep circling back to. Some recent books that I found very useful, and I think that you would find useful as well, in grappling with this very challenging set of ideas. Ibram Kendi, as you know, has run some recent awards for his book on how to be an anti-racist, and his really marvelous book, stamped from the beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, National Book Award winner. Izioma Oluo's So You Want to Talk About Race. It's a very conversational book. It dispenses with all the jargon. This woman is a very effective communicator, lives out in the Seattle area, and she really gets at many of these issues in a way that in very common sense, sort of plain English. Isabel Wilkerson, a masterful book on caste, following up on her really magisterial book, The Warmth of Other Suns, about the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North in the 20th century. A really just totally magnificent book. And caste, following up on that. And we're going to circle back to some key passages from caste at the tail end of this talk. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, is also a landmark work in critical race theory. And again, talking less theory than a historical account of how the war on drugs in the immediate, in sort of the aftermath of the dismantling of Jim Crow in the late 60s into the 1970s, that's just when the war on drugs kicked in. And the mass incarceration of people of color by the prison industrial complex in this country in ways that perpetuate kind of the racist underpinnings of our criminal justice system and of our legal system. And then, of course, the 1619 Project, which in some ways kind of sparked this right-wing backlash, because the 1619 Project, as you know, 1619 is the year the first African Americans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, in the Chesapeake Bay. And it is the beginning of racialized slavery in America. And so the authors of the 1619 Project are reframing American history in a way away from 1776 as the foundation of the Republic, and going back to 1619 as the pivotal moment in the formation of the Republic. So it's a new lens, a new way to look at the origins of American history. It's very provocative, and I think a very useful set of essays. And some not so recent books. Again, I said this stuff goes back a long time. These are mainly empirical studies by hard-nosed historians like W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP back in 1909. As you know, W.E.B. Du Bois was the the first Black PhD from Harvard, and went on to found the NAACP and become a leading voice for civil rights in the United States. He was also an incredible scholar. Um, so his book, for instance, all the way from the 1930s on Black Reconstruction in America, it stood the test of time. Frederick, all the way back to Frederick Douglass, to his narrative about what it means to be an American slave. He actually wrote 3 versions of this over the course of his life, and of course spoke, thousands of times before audiences, exploring the relationship between law and race and power. Again, all the way back to the 1830s. John Hope Franklin, former president of the American Historical Association, was writing about Reconstruction from slavery to freedom back in the 1960s. And Eric Foner as well. Edmund Morgan's book, American Slavery, American Freedom, goes back, it was published in 1976. It's about the ordeal of colonial Virginia, and I found it very useful in understanding the origins of these racial categories in the United States of America. So again, this is nothing new. This goes back well over a century in terms of talking about the relationship between race and class and law. So in other words, critical race theory builds on a centuries-long intellectual and historiographic tradition. For those who aren't historians, historiographic means kind of the history of history. Like, how has the history of slavery been represented over time? You open up a book from, say, the 1890s, and it was a very benign institution, and it was, friendly masters and benevolent masters and obedient slaves, and that's how it was written about. So historiography is kind of the history of history. So this is a part of a much longer intellectual tradition. And it's really as American as apple pie, or as jazz, or blues, and rock and roll. And you can't begin to understand American history without grappling with these fundamental issues of slavery and race and how the law shaped and defined both. So from my perspective as a historian and a college history professor, the simple reality is that through the vast spans of human history going back thousands of years, the law has mainly served as a tool of the powerful. And it's really only with Republican forms of government that emerged in the Age of Revolution, say the 1770s with the American Revolution, then the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Latin American Revolution. So 1770s to the 1820s, Republican forms of governance emerged. Only from that point forward could ordinary people have a hand in shaping the law in their own interest. So again, historically, the law is a tool of the powerful, and it's only recently, the past couple hundred years really, that ordinary people have had a hand in shaping that law. So let's do a quick and dirty kind of survey of American history from 1619 up to the present day. As you know, 1607 is the first permanent English settlement in North America, in Jamestown. 1619, the first African Americans enslaved Africans arrived from Barbados. They had actually been seasoned in Barbados, in the Caribbean, before coming to Virginia to work in tobacco. At that time, there are various forms of bound and coerced labor, and the racialized nature of slavery was not fixed. That there were white indentured servants who came over, often for an indenture of 7 to 9 years. And while you are an indentured servant, you are effectively a slave. You can be bought, you can be sold, you can be beaten, you can be whipped, right, as an indentured servant. The idea of indentured servitude is you give over 7 or 9 years of your life, and then at the end of your servitude, if you survive the disease and the mistreatment, then you are set free and given your so-called head right of 50 acres of land to go off and become a small farmer. This was the aspiration. So in the early years, from say 16 into the 1620s, 1630s, 1640s, tobacco is booming in the Chesapeake Bay region. Tobacco is an incredibly labor-intensive crop, and so there were vast profits to be made into the tobacco fields, and so an insatiable demand for labor, for white labor, for black labor, and the boundaries between these categories are really pretty muddy and mixed. Then comes a key moment. And it's one of these key moments in American history that not many people know about, but is absolutely critical in sort of crystallizing and solidifying these racial categories in law. And that comes in 1676. with a rebellion led by a guy by the name of Nathaniel Bacon, a relatively wealthy planter who formed an army of discontented white workers and discontented black slaves, and combined together this multiracial alliance of working people who then combined forces and marched on Jamestown, burned the House of Burgesses to the ground, the colonial legislature, and almost overthrew the colonial government. Bacon's rebellion was suppressed. It was defeated by the British and the colonial governors and the empire. And in the wake of Bacon's rebellion is when colonial Virginia then begins to codify in law these racial categories. The basic idea is to divide and rule, right? That we can't have poor whites and poor blacks combining forces together. We need to divide and create these racialized categories and inscribe blackness and associate blackness with permanent enslavement and whiteness with freedom. And so this becomes inscribed in law. There are three racial categories that begin to be codified after 1676: white, Negro, and Indian. And they're fundamentally racialized. And so this then is borrowed and adopted by all the other colonies in North America, because the planters and the merchants, who are, the landowners, the wealthy, can see the danger of their class power, their superior class position being challenged by the poor, by the rabble, by the people at the bottom. And so it's a classic effort on the part of the ruling class to divide and rule. And what emerges then in North America becomes unique, really, in the history of the world, this form of racialized slavery. As you know, slavery has existed since the dawn of civilization. Ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and so on. Many societies in the past have had various forms of slavery or bound and coerced labor. But what emerges in the Americas after the 1670s or so in North America is a distinctly racialized form of enslavement, where black skin and African ancestry and all the phenotypical characteristics associated with African ancestry become associated with permanent enslavement. And there were actually laws against individual manumission, that is, an individual slave master freeing their slaves, say upon their death, right? I want to write in my will that I want to free my black slaves. Well, no, colonial Virginia would not let you do that, because the danger was in creating a substantial population of free blacks, which would then muddy the waters and create this ambiguity that the ruling classes essentially wanted to avoid. So a unique form of racialized slavery, unique in world history. And then other colonies, as I say, adopt Virginia's legal categories. And then, but in the run up to the American Revolution, so 1676 is 100 years before the American Revolution, right? So time goes on, and in the 100 years from 1676 to 1776, white indentured servitude diminishes substantially. Most white people who come to North America are apprenticed in some fashion, but that form of servitude declines. And there are no white slaves after this point, and all permanently enslaved peoples are of African ancestry. So these racial categories become solidified and crystallized and codified in law in the century after 1676. Then comes, we all know the story of the run up to the American Revolution with the 7 Years' War, and it created this huge debt. And so Britain imposes all these taxes, and the colonists rebel with the cry of no taxation without representation. And the United States of America declares independence and writes their Articles of Confederation as the first sort of draft of a constitution. It doesn't really work, because the Articles of Confederation create almost like 13 separate countries. New York almost goes to war with Pennsylvania on border disputes and so on. You can't pass any laws unless it's unanimous. So essentially, they toss the Articles of Confederation in the trash can and start over in the summer of 1787. And they hammer out the U.S. Constitution in Philly in this long, hot summer of 1787. And so this Constitution that we revere to this day, that is our, the foundation of our form of government, is can be characterized in a lot of ways, but I think a really accurate way to characterize it would be a bundle of compromises over a whole series of issues, in particular over slavery, which is never actually mentioned by name. But much of the Constitution is a whole series of compromises between North and South, and slaveholders and non-slaveholders to try to get everybody on board. As you know, one of the most notorious compromises here was the 3/5 compromise, which gave Southern states, Southern states wanted to count every one of their slaves as one person for purposes of representation of the House. And the North said, oh, no, you can't do that. So they came up with this compromise where each slave was counted as 3/5 of a human being, which gave some political power more to the South, to slaveholding states, but not all. There was also, they basically kicked the can down the road for 20 years on the transatlantic slave trade. Said, we're not going to decide that now. We can't agree on it. So a 20-year delay on the transatlantic slave trade, which then was outlawed in 1807, along with Great Britain. There was also a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution about how runaway slaves, there's a requirement to return them to their masters. The Electoral College, this goofy system we still have, where we elect electors, and then at our state level, and this is the kind of at the root of the January 6th uprising, insurrection. We still have this bedeviled legacy of the Electoral College, which is essentially a way to try to create a buffer between the rabble, the mob, and political power, and relating to slavery. So the Constitution is passed, and the United States of America is young republic now. By the 1790s, the cotton gin is invented, and North and South become increasingly bound together as cotton is grown by slave labor in the South. It is shipped to the North and transformed into textiles in these textile factories in Massachusetts and Connecticut and New York and so on. So the economies of the North and the South become increasingly entwined together, with cotton from the South feeding the textile factories of the North, and those textile factories in turn drawing more white immigrant labor from Great Britain, from the Scots-Irish, and other white labor from Europe. In 1807, 1808, both Britain and the United States banned the transatlantic slave trade, which in many ways just means it turns off the spigot from Africa. But what it does is it ramps up the internal slave trade here in the United States of America. So the internal slave trade booms as the older colonies like Virginia and Maryland, the soil is getting exhausted now, and there's a tremendous demand for slaves in the expanding cotton regime of the South into Mississippi, Louisiana, Mississippi, and all the way into Texas, which is actually controlled by Mexico at this time, because cotton is very destructive of soils. And as the slave cotton regime expands to the West, many of the enslaved people from the older colonies are shipped down and traded in this booming slave trade in the what is called the antebellum period, from say 1800 to 1860, before the Civil War. So the internal slave trade booms, cotton becomes king in the South. One of the key sort of dynamics of this early Republican period is the emergence of law enforcement, primarily through slave patrols, in these efforts on the part of white planters to control and dominate their labor force and to prevent enslaved people from running away and freeing themselves. So slave patrols become the origins of much of the criminal justice system in the United States of America. There also emerges around this time a powerful movement for abolitionism. Frederick Douglass becomes one of the most powerful speakers for abolitionism in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, the whole sort of abolitionist Underground Railroad movement. Slave power becomes increasingly entrenched in the South. There's talk about slave power with a capital S and a capital P as this kind of gigantic power that is insisting on permanent racialized slavery. The nation almost goes to war in 1820, to civil war, as a result of the expansion of the republic to the west. And then a key moment comes, really the lead up to the Civil War, is the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48. where the United States of America essentially conquers the northern 2/5 of Mexico and gains vast swaths of territory, Arizona, New Mexico, all the way to California. And then the key question is slave or free, right? Is this going to be slave states or free states? And the nation almost goes to war a second time in 1850. And that is forestalled by this, again, another compromise 30 years after the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850. It has a bunch of provisions, won't get into the detail. California comes in as a free state, et cetera. But one of the provisions is a beefed up fugitive slave law, where now any slave master can capture any or any Black person, any person of African ancestry, anywhere in the Union, and drag them back to the South in chains, claiming that they are slaves. So the beefed up fugitive slave law of 1850, which is what Frederick Douglass is so lamenting in his 1852 speech that we read on the 4th of July. And then just a few years later comes one of the most pernicious decisions in Supreme Court history, the Dred Scott decision. We're hearing a lot about it today in the wake of the overturning of Roe. But the Dred Scott decision of 1857 basically said that the white man has, the Black man has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. These are the words of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney in the Dred Scott decision. And what overturned the Dred Scott decision was not another Supreme Court decision. It was the Civil War that came in 1861, as the nation is ripped apart on the basis of slavery. Here's another way to think about, and another window of looking at how these racialized categories are inscribed in law. Let's go all the way back to 1790. This is an image from the 1790 census from Annville, Pennsylvania. Look at the categories here. This is the first census in U.S. history. As we know, censuses are produced by governments, mainly for tax purposes, so they can enumerate people so they can tax them. And let's look at the categories of the people who are enumerated in the 1890 census. There's 4 categories: free white males, free white females, all other free persons, except Indians not taxed, and slaves. So we can see from the very beginning of the Republic, these racialized categories are inscribed in law. And these categories continue every 10 years, as you know, as a new census. So in 1800, they tweaked them a little bit, 1810, 1820, et cetera, but they remained in the census as they remain to this day. The one category that remained constant in all US censuses is the category of white people. Who's included in that category has changed over time. But again, since this I think this is a really vivid illustration of how these racial categories are inscribed in law. Here's another image of the 1790 census category. Just 4, right? As an aside here, in the Washington Post back about 6-7 months ago, when the first time I gave this talk, this just appeared, and it turns out the Washington Post did a very detailed study of lawmakers at in Congress over a whole series in the early Republican period. And as it turns out, more than 1,700 congressmen once enslaved Black people. This is who they were and how they shaped the nation. You can find this article in the Times. And this kind of, it's an incredibly useful synopsis of the ways that the composition of lawmakers who owned or claimed to own Black people over the course of the first 130 years or so of American history. So we see from the very first Congresses, 1789 to 91, well over half of the lawmakers were slave masters, and that gradually declines all the way to the Civil War. So if we kind of doubt whether racial categories are inscribed in law, or whether law has played a key role in creating and maintaining and reproducing these racialized categories, we don't need to go a whole lot further than look at who is holding power and who is making the law. So now we go through the Civil War, and then the Reconstruction amendments that emerge after the Civil War, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. In this dozen years of Reconstruction, where The Union wins and imposes its will on the South for about a dozen years. Black people, the freedmen, are voting, they're holding office, they're starting businesses, and they are insisting on full equality before the state. But then in 1877, well, actually, there's a whole series of white-led race riots against this empowerment of freed slaves. And then comes the Compromise of 1877 as a result of the disputed election of 1876. It gets complicated. The bottom line is the Union withdrew its troops from the South after 1877. The North is getting tired of thinking about Reconstruction and wants to move on. It's getting into the Gilded Age now. So the Compromise of 1877, Union troops withdraw, and the South essentially wins the peace. They lost the war and they win the Confederacy wins the peace. And there is what is known as redemption. That is, the leaders of the Confederacy are once again back in the seat of power. The Ku Klux Klan emerges, Jim Crow laws descend across the land by the late 1870s into the 1880s. The legally mandated segregation of the races in every sphere, in housing, in education, in transportation, in voting rights, in everything. So the shadow of Jim Crow, the reality of sharecropping, which is a kind of another form of enslavement in some ways, all held together by the ever-present specter of racial terror and lynching and racial violence. Over 4,400 people are lynched, that is extrajudicially killed by mobs, mainly white mobs, in the century after the Compromise of 1877. And then, of course, one of the most notorious Supreme Court decisions in history, Plessy v. Ferguson, where the Supreme Court essentially ratifies Jim Crow and says separate but equal is the law of the land, and that states get to decide on their laws with respect to race. So we move on into the 20th century now. And along comes the Great War, World War I, in Europe, and we have millions of men overseas fighting in the European theater. This creates tremendous demand for labor in northern factories that are producing guns and bombs and ammunition and weapons and so on. And so there is a massive migration from the South to the North, to Cleveland and Chicago and St. Louis and all across the industrializing North and West, by Black people escaping the racialized terror of Jim Crow and of sharecropping. As a result, there is this violent white backlash in cities across the country. What James Weldon Johnson, former president of the NAACP, called the Red Summer of 1919. Not red because of communism, but red because of the blood that flowed in American streets from the race riots in East St. Louis and Chicago and Tulsa and elsewhere, wherever there were substantial new populations of recently arrived Black people from the South, there were white-led mobs of violence, often in collusion with the police. The police would either participate actively or just stand back and let it happen. So these white-led race riots across the many urban centers across the country. So this continues into the interwar period, Jim Crow, sharecropping, lynching. There is no federal law against lynching. FDR is pressed by the NAACP. This is one of the main campaigns of the NAACP from its inception in 1909, is a federal anti-lynching law. You know when that law was passed? Last year. Finally, there was a federal anti-lynching law. I think it was either 2022 or 2021. I think it was 2021. After well over a century, because FDR did not want to alienate Southern Democrats. So the nation remains locked in this sort of system of Jim Crow and sharecropping and lynching. Then comes World War II and its aftermath. More than 1 million Black men serve in the European and Pacific theaters. And by the end of the Second World War, then, the hypocrisy of the United States of America presenting itself as the beacon of freedom in this ongoing Cold War with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union are the bad guys, right? They are the communist oppressors. We are the beacon of freedom, the free world. Well, think of the hypocrisy that it was so glaring when you have the nation that is touting itself as the beacon of freedom around the world systematically oppressing a substantial proportion of its own population and keeping them in permanent second-class citizenship. We also have technological changes like TV, which is able to broadcast into millions of homes events like the 1963 Birmingham, Bull Connor and the police dogs, and this repression and violence by the police and by city officials against peaceful protesters for civil rights in this emerging civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And then comes Brown, the Brown decision of 1954, Brown v. The Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which overturns Plessy v. Ferguson 58 years later in this unanimous decision saying separate is inherently unequal and that schools and other public facilities must desegregate with all deliberate speed. And that actually takes about 20 years for that actually to kick in. It's until the mid-1970s until Brown is effectively implemented. And then at the height of post-war liberalism in the mid-1960s, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, two of the most important pieces of legislation in all of American history. In 1963, you could put an ad in the newspaper saying white man wanted for job, and it was perfectly legal. In 1965, you could no longer do that. You could no longer discriminate openly on the basis of race. It didn't eliminate racism, of course, but it sought to eliminate the legal backing of racist policies. And then comes, there's a whole series of issues with respect to redlining as basically, there's so much to this story, like the GI Bill after World War II, which essentially educated an entire generation of young white men, was very often inaccessible to Black veterans because it was not required that banks or mainly, banks or insurance companies or others had to abide by non-racial categories. So redlining, affirmative action, busing, and then we talked a little bit about the war on drugs and the rise of the mass incarceration state from the 1970s and 1980s. So now we kind of get up into the present. So kind of these more enduring themes here that continue to bedevil this country that we saw in the aftermath of George Floyd, and we still see almost every day in this country, this racist police violence, the notion of the practice of qualified immunity, where individual police officers cannot be prosecuted for violent acts, for violent racist acts. We have racist drug laws, for instance, from the 1980s. The sentencing guidelines for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine were vastly different. Racist law enforcement, and then the whole sort of sphere of prosecutorial discretion, where prosecutors get to decide who they're going to prosecute and for what. And many of these crimes are left unprosecuted. So again, racism is in many ways systemic and baked into the system, and this is the whole emphasis of the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement that emerged in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. So to kind of circle on back and summarize, in my view, critical race theory offers a very useful framework for understanding American history. I don't think we can begin to understand any aspect of U.S. history without taking into account these some 246 years of racialized slavery and then almost a century of Jim Crow. And to my mind, all this should be taught in middle school and high schools. This is basic American history. I mean, it needs to be simplified and streamlined, but the basic ideas should be baked into the curriculum. This is part of who we are as a nation, and we can't be in denial about who we are. And again, in my view, this whole critical race theory so-called controversy was invented and cooked up and engineered by the right wing as a kind of wedge issue to throw red meat at the base and get people mobilized and all fired up and voting Republican. One of the best and most recent books, is deeply informed by critical race theory, but again, it's free of jargon. Ijeoma Oluo's So You Want to Talk About Race. It's accessible, it's readable, it's funny, but it's still pretty sharp edge. And it's only like $10 on Amazon. So a few concluding thoughts. How we frame this is important. It's often framed as the racism, and so systemic racism is framed as a kind of original sin of the United States. And I actually don't think this is a very helpful framework, because original sin, you can never transcend original sin. It's always there. And it also has this unduly religious and Christian connotation. Um, I would prefer to think about it as the foundational contradiction of the United States of America, that freedom and slavery emerged together as part of the same process of social transformation and political transformation from the 1600s into the 19th century. So this foundational contradiction that you can overcome and transcend. And that's what the 1619 Project is trying to do. With only partial success, in my view, but that's what it is attempting to do. And then I want to circle back then to a quote from Elizabeth Wilkerson's book on caste. And here's how she frames, and again, I think this is a very useful kind of metaphor. America is an old house, writes Isabel Wilkerson. We can never declare the work over. Many of you live in old houses, right? You know what an old house is like. We can never declare the work over. Wind, flood, drought, and human upheavals batter a structure that is already fighting whatever flaws were left unattended in the original foundation. When you live in an old house, you may not want to go into the basement after a storm to see what the rains have wrought. Choose not to look, however, at your own peril. The owner of an old house knows that whatever you are ignoring will never go away. Whatever's lurking will fester whether you choose to look or not. Ignorance is no protection from the consequences of inaction. Whatever you are wishing away will gnaw at you until you gather the courage to face what you would rather not see. You don't ignore a cracked foundation in an old house. And then one final reference, a Brooklyn High School junior, Christiane Calixte, in the Washington Post from this past January. And here's what a high schooler who actually learned about critical race theory said about it. It says, when we discussed CRT in our short workshop, we were taught the basic premise of critical race theory, that the underlying cause of racism within our country is institutional oppression built into American government and law. Were we taught that all white people are nothing but racist bigots? No. That all white people should feel guilty about events in the past they could not control? No. To hate their white friends and teachers? Absolutely not. CRT does not promote the hatred of white people, nor does the acknowledgement of white privilege. All people, regardless of race, can work together to dismantle the systems used to oppress minorities. White people are even encouraged to use their privilege to do so. There's a high school kid showing a lot of wisdom, actually. So that is my talk. And now I hope I didn't go too long. Oh my goodness, it's already 7 minutes after 8. I went too long. So I'm sorry I went over here. And I'm going to stop there and just kind of open it up here and see if people have questions, comments, reactions. I know that was a breathless kind of summary, but I hope you found it at least somewhat useful.
That was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. That was
Thank
good.
you. Thanks for listening.
That was good.
That was very, very good. It's kind of sad too, like when we think back on some of the things that were said in there. I'm trying to find exactly what the thought was, but just how our politics today, the people in power are not the people in power that are shaping, they're taking us back, not forward.
Mm-hmm.
It's very sad. The whole power play.
Yep. Thank you, Pat. So I'm gonna actually, why don't I stop recording? So again, thank you for listening. Maybe this will be up at the up on our website or somewhere at some point. I'm gonna stop recording. Thank you for listening.